Welcome everyone to Turning Carrots into Carrots, Trends in Attracting and Retaining Executives. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please send questions to the Q&A today, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the call. We try our best to answer all of your questions, but if for whatever reason we're unable to get your question today, please email learning@nfp.com. Today's presentation is being recorded. The recording and the slide deck will be distributed in the coming days. At this time, I'd like to hand over the call to our speaker, Tyler Brown, Senior Vice President and Practice Leader at NFP Compensation Consulting. Tyler, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amber, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for spending a little bit of your time with us today. We'd like to walk through this presentation and open the floor for some questions as we kind of move through this. Feel free to use the chat, and I'll try to answer these as we kind of move through this presentation. So in today's volatile environment, the most important things that we're seeing and we're hearing from clients, direct clients, indirect clients, and speaking engagements, white papers, et cetera, is the need to attract and retain talent to continue to keep those folks engaged with the business. And so we think that today's topics are incredibly timely, but also number two, it gives a differing perspective on these topics from a consultant's perspective that may validate some of your feelings and or give you additional topics to think about and take back to your own respective organizations or your own clients for that matter. So I'd like to jump right in here. And as part of that research that we've been conducting over the past 15-ish odd years and really honing in on the last 3 to 4 years, we wanted to give some insights into what's happening currently and then also be able to expound on that and what you can specifically take back to your organization. So I'll start here with two different perspectives. One is general HR and comp professionals such as myself, and then about leadership levels within a respective organization, specifically the CEO. So when we're looking at from an HR and compensation consulting perspective, I want to point out 4 specific areas that for 2023 are being viewed as the most important factors for a business to consider. So number 1 is recruiting. Number 2 is compensation. Number 3 is retention. And then number 4 is employee engagement. Each of those topics is showing up in every single one of these conversations that we've been having over the past, I would say, 36-ish odd months as far as what's important in 2023. Now, if you can see the illustration here is showing that those 4 areas are deemed to be more challenging than what they've been historically, which is really interesting when you think about the trend line of these 4 topics continuing to be of conversation year after year. And additionally, organizations are putting even a higher priority investment into these 4 areas than they are into other areas that I think are really interesting, which we'll show here on the next slide, as it relates to business continuity, business advancements, et cetera. So thinking through why the retention is so important or the attraction of individuals is so important, there's an associated cost with losing talent versus trying to bring talent in. And a recent study by Sherm has illustrated that it costs between 200% and 400% of annual salary to replace a position. Now, that comes in many different shapes and forms, right? It's not just direct salary cost, it's loss of institutional knowledge, it's new training, loss and development, succession planning. All of those kind of tie into that 200% to 400%. Now, what I want to really point out on this slide here is it doesn't matter if it's a US-based CEO or a global CEO. The number one topic that they are focusing on is attracting and retaining talent, which again is incredibly interesting when you see further down the list, when you think about a CEO's responsibility, improving cash flow, modifying their business models, lowering costs, all of those things fall well short of their number one priority, which is, again, attracting and retaining talent. Now, that 200% to 400% is just a general number, which is less than it would be if you were thinking about a more client-facing position, which again goes back to the incredible need to maintain the attraction. Now, when we're thinking about this attraction and retention, It boils down to the raging war on talent. Basically, every organization is competing for the same talent pool, right? Especially with transferable skill sets such as HR, accounting, finance, those roles specifically, IT also. It doesn't matter the organization that you're in, the filing status, whether you're a private company, a public company, or a not-for-profit. Each of those individuals can work for any of those organizations. And the talent pool is exactly the same. So from that perspective, it increases wages just by nature of having competing offers out there in the marketplace. Now, each one of these respective organizations in these three areas can offer differing levels of compensation and different structures of compensation that really boil down to what's in the best interest of their organization from an expense management perspective and their employees. Now, moving this one step further, I want to apply a little bit of what's called psychological perspective. When you're thinking about your employee population, it's important to think about how they're going to receive the compensation, not from an administration perspective, but from a true recipient standpoint of being compensated. How are they going to view the different levels of compensation that they're being provided? So I want to take a moment here and break down the four specific puzzle pieces, if you will, of compensation. And they do differ in their purpose and their strategy and what they're trying to do. Throughout our years of experience, market studies, and general best practices, we've isolated these four pieces. And these four pieces start from clockwise left to right. I'll start with the immediate, which is a base salary. The purpose of your base salary is just to maintain the ability to navigate your daily life, being able to pay your recurring bills, such as your mortgage payments, car loans, trips to the grocery store, just managing your day-to-day life. Now, short-term incentives, which have also been known to be called bonuses as well, just depends on the vernacular you'd like to use. They will reward for achievement of annual measures that should ultimately act as building blocks, so to speak, for midterm and long-term company strategies, retention, company successes, et cetera. I'll move down here to number 3, which is midterm, which these are traditionally known as your long-term incentives within a compensation consultant's perspective, such as your restricted stock option awards, phantom shares, those types of programs that can be equity or non-equity based. Those programs are meant to align the participant or recipient, if you will, to the needs of the business over a longer period of time to maintain some of that business continuity. But there's a return back to the recipient based on value of the stock or the option, or just in general, the profitability of the business. And then number 4, the item that gets missed a lot of times when we're talking about compensation is the true long-term vehicle, which is your retirement planning, which ultimately leads to your ultimate retention-based vehicles. Which provide this quote unquote stickiness from a tax efficiency perspective on an individualized basis. In a perfect world, a robust program would consist of each of these 4 areas of compensation constructed in the most effective way by business. And now you may be asking, well, what do you mean by most effective way? Well, what I think is important here, again, getting back to some of the psychological effects here, is focusing on how the workforce is changing as we sit here now and into 2030, specifically how this compensation is being received on a actual basis for these varying generations. So there's 5 generations that are currently in the workforce. The silent generation, which occupies right now around 2% of the total workforce, baby boomers, which are around 25%, Gen X 33%, millennials 35%, and Generation Z is around 5%. So when we're thinking about the current place of where the workforce sits, the perspectives on how compensation should be provided and what vehicle vary drastically from what it will be in 2030. If we look at the bottom right side here in the table, with baby boomers currently occupying around 25% of the workforce, you fast forward a mere 7 years from now, which may seem like a long time, but it's really not a really long time in actual practicality. you're going from 25% of the total workforce down to less than 1%. While inversely, Generation Z, which currently occupies only 5%, will make up just about a third of the coming workforce in the next 7 years. So again, I think it's important for us to dig into each of these generations to understand how they receive this compensation. And by doing that, allows you within your own organization to gauge your employee base, number one, to get a baseline of how your respective compensation programs would be viewed in a general sense. It isn't an exact science, but it is directionally accurate based on all these case studies that we've conducted over the past 15 to 20-ish years now. So I'd like to dig in on each of one of these specific generations. I'll start with the baby boomers. If you have a large capacity of baby boomers within your business, I think it's important to look at a few of these factors on how they're thinking about compensation. First, number one is they're nearing or they're entering their retirement eligibility windows, right? If they're not eligible to retire right in this moment, they will be in the next 5 to 10 years, going back to that prior slide we just looked at. As a way of managing their own personal taxes, they focused primarily on putting dollars into their 401k. However, when you do that, although it is a good method, you do have some stock price fluctuations. And so in 2008, 2020, and now 2022 through where we are here in 2023, there's been some erosion of value. There's been some upticks and some downticks, but it does have some of this volatility. So they have this on their mind. Number three, the need to maximize cash now in order to be able to fund their next stage in life, post-work windows. But then number four, I think is really important. The baby boomer generation, out of all four that we're going to talk about, first off here, they are the most loyal generation. They've stayed at their organizations for a long period of time. They have not historically jumped from company to company to company just for the increase in compensation. They value stability, which is why that 401k has historically been a really good thing for them. Whereas where they sit today, they're going to focus more on how can we get the most efficient cash into their hands to fund that next level of life for them. Moving down to Gen Xers, there's number one is there's flight risk concerns. And the reasoning for this is really two reasons. Number one is from a realistic perspective, they're viewing this as their potential last at bat. They're looking into the future going, we have only X number of years left of work life left, so to speak. And again, this is a general term, but they're looking at it as this is my last chance to hit a home run, if you will. So we want to really do the best that we can to maximize any value that they can get their hands on. And as of right now, odds of them having a career change is higher than it has ever been. And it's not for any other reason other than thinking through this from a mortality perspective, as well as just number of working years left. They want to maximize those. They've been witness to their parents' own financial downfalls and upswings, right? Black Monday, 2008 financial crisis, the continuing and ongoing oil and gas crunches, the cyclicality of those. They know how quickly value can be eroded or how quickly it can rise. And then lastly, as I already mentioned, they're looking to hit that home run to secure their financial future. And by doing that, they're looking for stock and equity offerings. They're maximizing the deferred compensation plan, etc. Millennials are an interesting group here. And the primary reason why these are such a unique group is there's two sub-generations within one generation. Specifically, older, quote unquote, older millennials think differently than their younger counterparts. And what I classify as older is those that are over the age of 30 as we sit here right now. And the reason why they think different than their younger counterparts is these older millennials are just now starting to buy their first homes, have their children, they're getting married, and they're having these sort of life events that are changing their perspectives. Whereas the younger millennials aren't quite in that position yet. So their thought process is a little bit different. So again, the millennials is an incredibly unique generation to consider if this is the makeup of your organization. Number two, for millennials, time is the enemy as it relates to their relationship with an organization. Specifically, they're thinking more in terms about short-term gratification. Historically, long-term value has been incredibly important, but for these particular folks, it's more about the short-term gratification. And that's driven by having the highest turnover rates on average, specifically staying with an organization from 1 to 3 years on average. And the reason why they're having this movement is that short-term gratification, looking for more compensation as quickly as they can possibly get their hands on it. And then number 3, again, a unique factor for millennials relative to baby boomers and Gen Xers is job satisfaction matters just as much as compensation, or specifically, how does the job make them feel? How do they feel about their organization that they're working for and its perspective in the general marketplace? And then lastly here is Generation Z. They're new to the workforce completely, mostly in the teenage areas. They have not been able to build any company or brand loyalty. They value instant gratification. Similar to millennials, it's not short-term gratification, it's instant gratification, with these individuals having grown up in what we call the digital world, where everything is at your hands in an instant. And oftentimes the feedback that's been given is that their viewpoints on compensation is not necessarily realistic. Specifically, some of these comments that have come back is, pay me for what I might be able to do, not what I'm actually demonstrating what I am able to do, which creates an interesting conundrum between the employee and obviously the employer. And then what is the most interesting about Generation Z is, in quotes here, feeling of why. Why do we have to work for the things that we have? Working gets in the way of my social life. So in order to really get the Generation Z individuals to focus on the work, is providing a compensation structure that offsets or is large enough to offset their desire to not work, which again, all 4 of these generations has such a unique dynamic of how they think, how they feel, and how they respectively respond back to their organizations. So now that we have a baseline of the 4 different generations in the workforce and how it's going to change, what I get asked oftentimes is, so how do we navigate everything that we're seeing here? Or Tyler, please help me understand, what do we do in these aspects? Well, I think it's important to look at everything as it relates to the compensation of these individuals and understanding why we are where we are. So I'll touch here on inflation for just a moment. So companies and employees both feel the crunch of inflation. It's a realistic issue that we're all dealing with as it stands here, with record inflation, reducing spending power for the individual while also increasing the costs associated with doing business, specifically as it relates to raw materials and labor costs. Companies have tried to manage the inflation for their respective workforces by providing increases in compensation. However, studies have shown that there is a tipping point as it relates to compensation and inflation, where they no longer run in parallel paths and they start to create this dispersion between one another. As you can see here on the illustration on the bottom left-hand side here, all of these dots, they're kind of circulating near that trend line. And what we're seeing here is that compensation starts to break apart after you get around 6%. There's less consistency on how it's being applied within organizations to employees, et cetera. And this phenomenon is primarily due to the resulting impact of rising rates and cost of goods. Specifically, each investment back into people has to come from somewhere from a company's perspective. And with that understanding, organizations ultimately have to offset that cost back to their customers by increasing their products from a cost expenditure perspective, which can have a long-term correlation to negative connotations back to business continuity, feelings about an organization as it relates to, well, their prices are too high, I can no longer afford them. So there is this tipping point that happens around 6%. And with us being within record inflation, as we sit here north of 7.5%, 8.5%, right now, the inflation figures that are being provided for base salary adjustments or compensation adjustments as it stands are falling short to those inflations, which means there's about a 2% cut in pay, so to speak, that the employee is feeling currently. So as a way for an organization to help manage these costs, budget planning has been incredibly important. Not that it hasn't been historically, but it has even grown in its prevalence of importance over the past 2 years, further than it's ever been before. With many organizations forward planning budgets out 2, 3 to 4 years in order to best manage the ups and downs of a market, which has historically been only up, with average increases around 3%, maybe 3.5% on some good years. So what are companies doing and what are they thinking about? Around 60% of organizations notice that there's going to have to be adjustments to their budgeted values that were set at the end of 2022, looking forward here into 2023, now that we're about 5 months into 2023 on a calendar basis, which means that about 60% of these organizations got it wrong, meaning they either over budgeted or under budgeted. Specifically, 16% think that the budget is going to be less than what they anticipated it being, meaning they were thinking that there would be a higher increase of compensation expense that needed to be made than what they are actually looking at today. Whereas 44% of companies out there have said we will ultimately end up spending more than we ever budgeted for, which gets back to the business continuity issue. There's more dollars going out the door than what had been budgeted for within the organization. So you may be asking, look, so I hear what you're saying about how companies are thinking, but why are they doing what they're doing? And specifically, organizations that have expected an increase in their budgets is primarily due to the competition of labor. If you look in the top right here of the targeted illustration, 71% of those organizations believe that it's a supply shortage of labor, which is going to be driving the changes here. Number two, is there some improved economic conditions, which again raises some of that spending power potentially. And then lastly here is a change in compensation philosophy, which we will touch on compensation philosophy in just a little bit. Whereas organizations that expect it to be lower, they're concerned, 75% of them are concerned about where we're sitting today with the recessionary fears of how the market is reacting. And when you think about it from that perspective, what they're trying to do is hedge their bets, so to speak, meaning if markets do hard correct and there is a recession, those individuals or those organizations don't want to have to make cuts to their employee base because they've overspent, so to speak. Prime examples of these, we can go and look at some of the tech companies that have had large layoffs over the past year or so. There was a large run-up in hiring. The market has corrected a little bit, and now there's been a large cut in staff across a lot of those organizations. So as to keep that from happening, around 75% have slowed their budget so as to not have to have those discussions. Now, most interesting out of this slide here is at the bottom of the illustrations here. 41% of companies believe that they're losing talent due to insufficient increases in pay, which has resulted directly in their loss of talent. Now, what I find to be interesting about this illustration is now that 41% believe that it's the reason why they're losing talent, 34% that think that pay is not the reason why, which we need to unpack that a little bit more about why they are losing this talent if they don't believe it's compensation. 14% also believe that they're not experiencing a talent loss at all, which those organizations could be on the upswing of their life cycle. So around 74%, believe that there is a direct impact or indirect impact around compensation. So what we may be asking now is, now that we know where the market is, where the market has sat, I know my employee base, Tyler, what should I be thinking about? Well, I've got 4 specific things to focus on. And I'm going to start number 1 with our first action, which is having a strategic approach to your compensation, first and foremost. So what we've done is we've outlined here from a survey from PayScale which has outlined what's called a compensation philosophy, right? A compensation philosophy allows you to set some guardrails around your compensation programs and how you'd like to compensate relative to the marketplace. What this allows you to do is have some guardrails around your compensation plan or programs, and allows you to be more nimble and move quicker when it comes time to either one, have to renegotiate or try to keep an employee from leaving in the event they have received an offer, or number two, you're trying to recruit from the outside. Sometimes those processes can take an incredible length of time, and in a lot of instances, time is, again, it's the enemy. We don't have the time to not be prepared. So first and foremost, we need to set up a compensation philosophy. What I'd like to point out here is on the bottom left side, all the way to the left here, is 52% of organizations target the 50th percentile. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is they're setting their compensation programs in aggregate, mind you, to be around the 50th percentile of their respective pay markets. That means there's 50% less and 50% more. They're sitting literally in the middle of their group, which means that they're paying in a safe space as it relates to how compensation should be delivered. Now, there's varying perspectives across organizations on how they do this, which I find to be incredibly interesting. I'll focus on two, which from an outsider compensation consultant perspective does not make a lot of sense for me, which is 9% stating that they pay below market. Now, that's an interesting commentary around why you pay below market, which again makes no sense to me, but is around 9% of organizations out there that do that. And then lastly here is on the very far right, there is not a market-based structure. There is a structure put in place, but it is not based on how market rates are associated, which means they're kind of aiming in the dark, so to speak, of how they're trying to set compensation. It doesn't have a lot of rhyme or reason behind it. But not only how are we delivering compensation via our more strategic approach, is how often are we going to be providing this compensation? So number two, the second action, is reviewing the frequency of our increases. Historically, what we've seen has been an annual approach, and the overwhelming majority of organizations, it being once per year, we're going to review compensation and we're going to make adjustments at that given time. If you look in the teal box here, the second from the left under annual, in 2022, 79% of organizations mentioned that they are providing an annual based approach. Whereas here in 2023, 69% are doing this on an annualized basis, which means there's been a 10% delta or change of 10% of the companies out there on how they're thinking about compensation. And the primary reason is because it's moving so quickly, they can't keep up, or they're falling behind if they're only reviewing this once a year. So what have organizations done? Well, that 10% has been split amongst two different perspectives. They're now breaking it up into twice per year, or they're moving even to a quarterly basis. So in 2022, looking at it from a twice annual perspective, 4% of organizations did these adjustments twice per year, whereas in 2023, 11% are looking at it from a twice per year perspective. So there's an increase of 7% there. Moving over to quarterly, so these are those organizations that are moving at light speed. You have a very unique talent base. You're based in IT maybe, or some of these more fast-moving operational-driven organizations where you have field workers, and you need to look at this on a quarterly basis. So in 2022, 1% of organizations did adjustments on a quarterly basis, whereas in 2023, 5%. So it has changed dramatically in how organizations have made these adjustments. So my second action and second recommendation for any organization that I talk to is look at what the frequency of your compensation adjustments is. And let's think about why we're doing it once per year. Why are we doing it twice per year? Or why would it make sense to look at it quarterly? And it may differ across the entire population. Your executives may have a different structure than what your management level employees would have. And then your general employee may have a much different time perspective as well. So it's staying open and having these conversations around what makes the most sense within our organization. The third action I have here is to review and or monitor your current annual incentive plan, or more commonly known as your bonus plan. Now, what's interesting here is over the past 15 years, I received the same question over and over and over and over again, but it's, do bonuses or does annual incentives actually work? Well, in a short word, yes, they absolutely do work, but there's a huge caveat I want to make here. These bonuses or these annual incentive plans work if they're constructed correctly. And what I mean by constructed correctly is the value proposition appropriate for a given position? Is it aligned to company goals and behaviors? And then number three, ultimately, does it drive those behaviors? Now, you may be asking, well, how do you know that they actually work? You're telling me they work, and I trust your thoughts and opinions, but help me understand why. Well, we've looked at over 20 different studies, books, white papers, university disclosures from some of the leading governance practices out there. And basically what those have all told us is one real honest truth, is that companies that have these type of variable plans, they perform better than those that don't. Specifically, those that don't typically will be in the bottom quartile of their performance relative to those that do have them. Now, I get back to having a program that's constructed correctly. There needs to be line of sight, meaning how does an individual directly impact that said annual incentive or bonus program? It's really getting down to a more granular level of how can they impact it. I often pose this question in any company that we're working with to develop a program like this is, if you're given a task in which you have no control over the outcome, does it change your behavior on how you interact with that day-to-day task? And after a moment or two of reflection, generally the respective client or company that we're working with will say, no, most likely not. It does not impact how I'm doing things. So that's when we start to get into a more strategic discussion around these bonus plans or annual incentive plans of how can we best align the vision or the actions of the individual to tie back to the overall results of the organization. So again, having this line of sight is imperative. But also, I want to focus here for just a moment on why pay should match performance, right? In the event that you do have a good structure where there is good line of sight, what oftentimes gets missed here is the payout scales that go with these programs, right? Outsized performance should correlate to an outsized pay program. Inversely, if performance is less than what we expect it to be, then payout should be less than what would be expected. Now, one caveat I want to make here is about extraordinary events. These extraordinary events are items that can't be accounted for at the outset of a given performance period, meaning if we have a bonus program that's expected to last 1 year, starting on the first day of the year and ending on the last day of the year, there's 365 days of potential variability or extraordinary events to occur. So I'll use 2020 and COVID-19 as the prime example as a real-time extraordinary event whereby bonuses were completely decimated. So by March and April of 2022, most bonus programs that had been put in place effective January 1st were completely out of the money. There was no likelihood or immediate future looking forward where bonuses would be achieved. So what potentially could have happened there from a motivational perspective? What typically would happen there is a pullback as there's no incentive to continue to move forward or drive performance, which is an unintended consequence of a program, which is why we like to recommend as part of any bonus program, there is a discretionary pool that can be applied to account for those extraordinary events. Now, what that does is it adds a human element to the program in the event of a formula not producing the outcome in which it doesn't align with the efforts of what actually transpired. And I can speak for the overwhelming majority of organizations out there where performance did not stop because of the pandemic. Individuals and employees kept working hard, kept moving forward, tried to maintain value of their businesses. So as there was a place to call home as it relates to a business and a working environment. So having this discretionary area of payout, again, adds this human element that allows the business to be able to provide for motivational purposes of doing the right thing. Did we continue to move forward even though the financial calculation, the formula, did not pay out in the way that we all had hoped it would? And then number 4, my fourth action here that I always recommend is looking at your midterm and long-term programs. Basically, what we need to do here is we need to look at who's eligible to participate, who's not eligible to participate, challenge the status quo. Is the plan, or are the plans that we have in place, are they driving the behaviors that we're looking for? Now, what you may be asking about these mid and long-term plans is, well, they come in so many different shapes and sizes. Well, I could tell you we'd need another webinar to cover the aspects of both of these types of programs, but I'll try to look at this on 2 different bases. One is an equity-based vehicle and one is a non-equity-based incentive or vehicle as well. And who would use one versus another. So I'll start with equity-based incentives. These equity-based incentives are going to be primarily found in your publicly traded companies because they have stock that is readily available to be issued, whether it be in a stock option, a restricted stock, grant, performance shares, or some other variation, but they're using actual ownership of the business to deliver that. Some privately held organizations do this as well, depending on their ownership structure and where they're trying to recruit talent from and what they're trying to align them to. And then lastly, here is the non-equity based incentives. This is primarily found in not-for-profits, some for-profit organizations, and then obviously the balance of other privately held organizations that do not use actual stock. These are basically going to be cash-based incentives, or they look and feel like a share of stock, but they're actually going to be paid in cash. For a nonprofit, it's typically done via a deferred compensation plan or some other retirement vehicle to consider. So when we're thinking about mid and long-term compensation, this is probably the most single highly customizable perspective. And I would tell you this fourth action is where most organizations get it wrong. Most organizations do a great job in their base salary planning. Most of them do an okay job with having their bonus plans set out and appropriate. They do an okay job on the timing of how they deliver compensation. But I would say 80% or more do not do a good job as it relates to midterm and long-term incentive plans. They don't review these often enough. They're more a knee-jerk reaction when things come up, i.e. trying to recruit a highly talented person that may have these types of vehicles or compensation structures within a very different organization they're coming from. And we have to knee-jerk react to putting a plan in. And when that happens, it's oftentimes not thought all the way through as it relates to unintended consequences. Getting a program put in place is great, but not putting the right program in place can be detrimental to the company over a long period of time. So again, this will probably take another webinar, which I'm sure we will be doing in the near future around midterm and long-term incentive plans, the reasoning why to include each one of these. But each of these has their place. And then again, this is where most organizations get it wrong. So if I had to summarize the 4 things that an organization needs to do, and I would say this is an annual review process, that these 4 actions need to be reviewed on an annual basis. Number 1 is reviewing our compensation philosophy. If we don't have one, there needs to be one. Number 2, reviewing the timing or frequency of how often we review compensation and what we're providing to our employee base. Number 3 is reviewing your annual bonus plan or your annual incentive plan, if you will. And then number 4, evaluating the structure and the mechanics, eligibility, et cetera, of your midterm and long-term plans. If all 4 of these things are done in unison and they're all thoughtful in their approach and how we apply them based on our background of our employee base, depending on what generation they fall in or what the mixture of our working folks are. If we do each of these four things, it puts you on a much better, one, competitive path to attract, retain, and motivate. But number two, from a business operations and continuity perspective, it ensures that those employees will be there and they will be aligned from a vision perspective with the business in both the short term and the long term. So that concludes the presentation. I'd love to open the floor up for any questions that anyone may have. Happy to take those. If you want to put those in the chat, I'd be happy to address those as they come in. I'm not seeing any questions coming in. We will make these slides available for everyone as well. So we also have contact information. Please feel free. You can directly send me your questions or through our Human Capital Solutions team here. We're happy to engage in any conversation and be the best partner we can for you, answering any of those questions you may have.
All right. Well, thank you, Tyler, for sharing your valuable time and expertise with us today. To reiterate, today's presentation was recorded. The recording and the slide deck will be distributed in the coming days. At the end of this call, a survey will populate in a new window. Please take a brief moment to complete the survey, as it lets us know what topics are important to our listeners and helps make our education program as current and relevant as possible. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.